Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Wednesday, just after former NAACP President Ben Jealous announced he's officially entering the race for governor in Maryland, I sat down and interviewed him. I want to ask you about the murder of Richard Collins III earlier this month. Just a few days before his graduation, Collins, a black student, Army lieutenant at Bowie State University in Maryland, was visiting the nearby University of Maryland at College Park when he was stabbed at a bus stop near campus by Sean Urbanski, a white student who was a senior there. Though investigators have not yet determined whether the killing was a hate crime, Urbanski was a member of a now-deleted Facebook group called Alt-Right Nation, which published white supremacist content. I wanted to ask you about this, something that the man you'll be running against, Republican Governor Larry Hogan, who hopes to be the second Republican governor to win a second term since the 1950s. He condemned this on his Facebook page. Wanted to ask you about his response, how you would respond differently, especially in light of you were one of the leading voices in the country when it came to the murder of Trayvon Martin by the white vigilante, George Zimmerman.
You know, I commend Governor Hogan for speaking up and speaking out. He, quite frankly, was, one of the few in our state who did. There were many folks that day who, oddly, leaders in our state commented about Manchester and didn't comment about College Park. And I appreciate him for doing that. I sat there amongst the students at Bowie State, students from Bowie State and from College Park, from the surrounding community, all grieving. They should have been at the highest moment of their lives as they or their friends were graduating from college, but the actions of this killer, this deranged, hate-infused killer, had brought us all to the lowest of lows. And I was inspired by them and their resilience and their hope and their love and their ability to come together across all the lines of race and religion that we're told in our society again and again are so important, as if they don't matter a thing, just by their love for each other and their determination to build a better future. And I saw it again with Richard Collins' family when I sat a few aisles over for them at their son's funeral. Again, a family really grounded in love of God and country and family, resiliently and defiantly saying that they were going to be like Dr. King and choose love over hatred because hatred was too much of a burden to bear. Richard Collins was a beautiful young man who truly dedicated his life to serving others, who was cut down on a college campus just a couple of days after he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in our Army. One of the most beautiful things that was said at his funeral was by an administrator at Bowie State who said that he hoped that there would be a metal ribbon for a young man who had waged a war against hate. Because you see, when this young man with his knife approached Richard and told him to get out of the way, so clearly, menacingly full of hate, Richard said no. And it was that refusing to allow himself or his friends to be degraded and humiliated because of their color or the color of their friends that ultimately cost him his life. Our young men have too much to worry about, to have to worry about this too. And we've had two white young men in Maryland in the last 6 months or so kill black men apparently because of their race, once in New York City, once here in Maryland. It's time for our leaders in the state to go even further. We've got to really admit that when it comes to the issue of sort of hatred and tension, ethnic tension, there is nothing different about our state. There's nothing here that either exists or doesn't exist that's not in the rest of the country. That we have all of the problems. We are a microcosm of this country. But what makes us different, especially among states south of the Mason-Dixon, is that we've shown our ability to come together courageously on the issues of civil rights. We had 1 year here, Amy, where we abolished the death penalty, passed marriage equality, passed the DREAM Act, and expanded voting rights even as our neighbors were suppressing them. And it's time for us to have a governor to really lead our state in doing that again. And that's where I think Hogan could do more. I was glad that he spoke out. But he is not showing real leadership to pull us together, to have the tough conversations, to really challenge people, many of them in his own party, to evolve, to move on, to open their hearts, to follow the examples of George Wallace, of Robert Byrd, of so many other people who once filled with hate, who learned how to love. It's time for us in Maryland to really come together. And you know, Amy, it has great meaning to me. In about a week or so, we'll be celebrating, it's almost 2 weeks, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of Loving versus Virginia. You know, that case that made my own parents' marriage legal here in Maryland and set us on the path to really having full marriage equality as we now have with some of the laws that we passed just a few years ago. And that's an example of what it looks like when government leaders, in that case judges, act courageously to help us all come together, and we need more of that right now.
Can you talk about your parents and what that meant, that they lived in Maryland and couldn't marry because your father was white and your mother African American?
Yes, you know, my parents met in Baltimore as teachers at Harlem Park Junior High. My mom had desegregated Western High School for girls here about a decade earlier. My father was one of the few white men jailed in Baltimore for lunch counter sit-ins, lunch counter desegregation sit-ins. They were bonded as civil rights workers and as fellow teachers. They fell in love, and they were forced, actually, to drive 50 miles to get married inside of Washington, D.C., because it was illegal for them to be married here. And then they were required to move out of the state because literally, like the Lovings, they would have to go to bed every night fearing that the sheriff or the police could come storming into their house to lock them up just simply for being married across racial lines. My parents instilled in me a great sense of hope and belief in our country, and also the strength and the courage to defy even the law when it is unjust. And in these times when we have President Trump pushing families of our neighbors here in Maryland deeper into the shadows so that they can be threatened and their families torn apart by his bad policies, and our governor remains silent, we're living through times that call for each of us to decide whether we are going to collaborate with unjust laws that needlessly humiliate families, or we are going to stand up and resist and ultimately come together as neighbors and move our state forward. And that's why I'm throwing my hat in the ring and I'm running to be the next governor of the great state of Maryland.
Ben, Our Revolution just tweeted, our inaugural board member, Ben Jealous, is making a big announcement today from Baltimore. You're on the board of Our Revolution. You were an early supporter of Bernie Sanders. Is Bernie Sanders going to be endorsing you? And how does your agenda fit into the overall Sanders Our Revolution agenda?
You know, Bernie and I bonded as I chaired his campaign here in Maryland, as I helped convince people across the country and across our state to vote for him. We see the world very similarly. He, like my father, was one of the few white men to go to jail with the Congress of Racial Equality and desegregation sit-ins. And he, you know, like so many activists of that generation, has been consistent his entire life, always fighting for racial justice and economic justice. His platform is very similar, quite frankly, in many ways, to the platform of the NAACP, the call for raising the minimum wage, the call for ensuring that we recognize health care as a right, the call to protect our environment, the call to support organizing, et cetera, and also to support our small businesses. And so I will very much push forward the agenda that we discussed in that campaign, ending mass incarceration, using the savings to pay for ending this era of massive college debt. I'll also bring to it my life lived as a community organizer, as a civil rights leader, my demonstrated success helping to push states forward beyond eras of mass incarceration and past Justice Reinvestment Act, so the money gets reinvested in education. I'll bring to it my experience working with small businesses when I was young, running a trade association of more than 200 small businesses, and today as an investor in Startups for Good, startups that grow through the marketplace and make the world better for working people by solving tough problems like cutting the cost of calling home from prison by 80%. And so it's, I come into this as a civil rights leader, as a progressive, very active in Jesse Jackson's campaign and Barack Obama's campaign and a Bernie Sanders campaign. And I also come into this as a citizen of our great state of Maryland who is absolutely committed to growing our economy from the bottom up.
So how would you distinguish yourself from, there's 7 or 8 people who are going to be running? The first person to announce was Alec Ross, a former advisor to Hillary Clinton, tech and entrepreneur. Is this going to be a kind of Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders replay? But also, you've been traveling the state as others have, and in a straw poll, you came in 3rd last week behind Congressman John Delaney, as well as the Baltimore County Executive Kamenetz in a straw poll held in Western Maryland.
Look, I was grateful to the people of Western Maryland for the time. And, that straw poll is of folks who gather at a meeting in Congressman Delaney's district and not far from, sort of in the same media market as Kevin Kamenetz. And it was an honor to me as the outsider, as the underdog, to come in 3rd amongst 8. We've got a real shot here. I mean, when a guy who's rooted in West Baltimore comes in 3rd when he hasn't even announced his campaign in a poll in Western Maryland, something's happening. And folks in the state see that. Our revolution stretches across the state. The NAACP crosses the state. And it's those two traditions of progressivism and civil rights that I come out of, and it's what makes our state so great and our chances so good. So we're going to run a tough campaign. We have a real shot. Somebody today said to me, that this moment after Bernie's campaign reminds them of 1989, after Jesse Jackson's campaign, when we saw Wilder win, when we saw Dinkins win, when we saw Harold Washington win. And we know that out of sort of great presidential campaigns that don't quite make it all the way, can come transformative movements that allow breakthrough candidates to move their states, to move their cities forward in ways that nobody thought was possible just moments before.
Ben Jealous, will you be accepting corporate contributions?
Of course not. Of course not.
Will you be pushing for universal health care or single payer Medicare for all?
I was very clear today that we will ensure that every citizen in Maryland has access to quality, affordable health care no matter what happens in Washington. This is my first day on the campaign. We're digging into exactly how we'll do that. I'm inspired by the states like New York and California that believe they have found a way to provide the equivalent of Medicare for all. I've asked for the details. I've asked for those plans. We are digging in, but this campaign starts day one from the position that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and that if the federal government seeks to take it away, seeks to even tolerate this status quo where so many of our neighbors don't have access to it, that we will find a way that everybody in our state will have access to quality, affordable healthcare.
Does this mean you'll be running as an activist?
I don't know any other way. I don't know any other way. I've been a civil rights activist and a progressive my entire life. I'm the child of civil rights activists. I'm the grandchild of civil rights activists, and I'm the great-grandchild of abolitionists. And so the reality is that I will run as Ben Jealous. I will run as that, organizer rooted in West Baltimore, but networked across this country. And somebody who can lead this state in a way that helps us build from right where we are, build a regenerative, organic, growing economy, but also benefit from bringing in some of the biggest companies in the country to our state. Because right now, for instance, in the Silicon Valley, our peers at companies like Facebook and Google are under pressure to become more inclusive. And here in Maryland, almost 20% of the computer scientists are Black. Here in Maryland, we have already begun building a great tech sector that has defined itself by being the place where the world's greatest minds come to solve some of the world's greatest problems like cancer and cybersecurity. And we can absolutely succeed in building a forward-thinking 21st century economy that has room for all of our communities and helps to lift all boats, even as we make it easier for folks to grow their flower shop or their detail shop.
Former NAACP President Ben Jealous is now running for governor of Maryland. I spoke with him just after he announced his candidacy Wednesday outside his cousin's West Baltimore flower shop, which he opened after the 2015 uprising that followed the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore police custody. That does it for the show. On Friday, we'll have more on President Trump's decision on the Paris Climate Accord. And to see all our coverage on climate change, go to democracynow.org. Also sign up for our newsletter there. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Malkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud, Tarina Nadura. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.